Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's episode of Learn with Lorna, which is episode number 215. My sincere apologies for how long that has taken me. That is my fifth attempt to get Facebook to let me start this video, so apologies that has been such a clunky start this morning. I will need to try and work out why this keeps happening. So welcome to episode number 215, where we are looking at the fascinating subject of street names, one of my absolute favourite things to think about. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. We have 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, Wick, Fort William and Portree, where we look after records, both historic and current, relating to this part of the world. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. And if you're just joining subsequently, again, my apologies for the clunky start. Not anything I could control, I'm afraid. Facebook throwing me out and freezing the screen repeatedly. Okay, so this week, as I said, we are looking at a subject that I find absolutely fascinating, and I know that a load of other people do as well. The subject of street names, or as I discovered as I was putting this together, odonymy, the street and road naming conventions. That's the technical term. If you've got any thoughts or comments as we go through about particular street names, please do throw them in the chat, because I'm genuinely really fascinated by this. When you go to a new place and you're looking around at street names, perhaps to navigate, perhaps to understand a bit more about where you are and where you're going, then you might have a passing thought about why a street bears the name it does. But sometimes when we're familiar with a place, we don't spend much time thinking about it. We just take it for granted that, for instance, in Inverness there's King's Mills Road, and I wonder how many people stop and think about the King's Mills that used to be there. So we either assume it's common knowledge why something got a name, or we just take it for granted and don't think about it too much. But sometimes ones really spark our interest. For me, it was always the Wisp in Edinburgh. I just thought, why on earth is it called the Wisp? But names have come about for a reason. They have been deliberately chosen, or they have come into common usage and then been kind of ratified through an official process, a later decision. They've perhaps been derived from Gaelic, they've been perhaps a corruption of another language, and often our street names convey information or they carry stories. And street names often bear witness to our past, whether that's our local past, our national, international past, and they also reveal something about what we want, or what we wanted, to say about ourselves and our communities. The most common street name right across the UK and in Scotland is High Street, followed by Main Street. And both of those indicate obviously the importance, that particular importance, or its relative status of that road. It's a road of higher importance than other roads. It's the main road through a settlement. And according to Historic England, High Street has been an incredibly common street name across the UK since the 12th century onwards. And incidentally, I'm saying High Street there, and street is much more common across the UK than road or avenue or any other types. It's a word that's come down to us from the Latin strata and the Old English straight. So although we do have obviously roads and places and avenues and groves and all sorts of other things, street is by far the most common name. Now, many streets, like many place names in general, take their name from their position within the landscape. So the names might relate to where that road is within the town or village. So some might be directional. For example, East Street in Tain, or West Shore Street in Ullapool, South Road in Wick, or like Kingussie and various others, West Terrace, Middle Terrace, East Terrace. So they show where those streets are within the settlement. Or they might be directional in another way. They might point towards another place. So for instance, we have North Road in Fort William is the road pointing north. Old Edinburgh Road in Inverness, Old Caithness Road in Helmsdale, Black Isle Road in Muir of Ord. All of those are kind of self-explanatory in that they're pointing to the way to get to another place. Sometimes there are multiple different reasons, possible reasons, for why a street might have a particular name. And quite often there have been multiple names for a street. Wonderful Margaret McDougall, ex-curator and librarian in Inverness, wrote in her many research notes. One of them is about the street names in Inverness and the history of them. So I'll be dipping in and out of her research notes throughout this episode alongside other things. But here are her notes on the story of Eastgate in Inverness. Previously called Petty Street, she says it's always been debated as to whether the name was given because it led to the parish of Petty or because the petty customs were collected here. In March 1888, a petition signed by many townspeople was presented to the borough police commissioners asking that the name be changed to Victoria Street. She puts as a aside that when that name was suggested, other names that were suggested included Culloden Street, Market Street, Albert Street. After discussion, it was agreed to leave the old name, Petty Street. At one time, the name Eastgate was applied to a small portion of that street, which disappeared, the name was applied to a small portion of that street, but gradually the name of Petty Street started to fall out of use and disappear, and the Eastgate name became more common. The meaning is obvious. It is the eastern entrance to the town. And what's interesting about that is anyone who's familiar with Inverness will probably have a particular thing in their head now as I describe Eastgate, probably picturing the shopping centre in the middle of the town. But actually that is worlds away from what Margaret McDougall would have known Eastgate to be at the time she wrote that. She probably wrote that in around the 1940s, 1950s. And Eastgate now is almost unrecognisable from that time because of the huge developments in the 1970s and 1980s. But despite that, despite all of those changes, the name of Eastgate remains, although the name of Petty Street has been lost. And so that relates to what I wanted to talk about next, the next kind of group of street names. Because it talks about, the Eastgate example talks about the fact that it was where the East Gate was. Collectively, the most common group of street names in Scotland relate to what can or what could be found on that street. And there are so many examples of this. So for instance, Broadford's Ford Road, where it crosses the river, or the Road of the Hay in Portree. So these streets are usually named because they are pointing to a facility or a landmark that was on that street. So you will find multiple examples across the Highlands and far beyond of Bridge Street, Castle Street, Station Road, Bank Street, Church Street, Academy Street, Mance Road. All of these kind of names that talk about what was on that street are very, very common. Margaret McDougall describes Academy Street in Inverness like this. This road was previously called New Street. It was renamed when the Royal Academy was built there in 1792. The old academy stood on the site but then became Burnet's Bakery. It eventually became too small and a new building was erected at the top of Stephen's Brae. It was opened in February 1895. So she's talking there about the fact that the academy came and went. It was originally called New Street when it was built. The academy came and brought prestige to that street and brought a landmark to that street, which meant that it was renamed Academy Street. But then when the academy moved, the name stayed. And we find that replicated across towns, that the building or the facility that's given that street its name moves site. So the academy moves because it needs a bigger school, the bank closes, the church becomes a library, whatever it might be, but the street name remains. And those names would once have conveyed useful information, and they still sometimes do. There's still a bridge in Rosemarkie's Bridge Street. But many of those names now remain as a legacy of something that has gone. There's no station now on Ardissere's Station Road. And these names often remain as a record of what has been, either what has been in the recent past or what's been in the long gone past. And some good examples of this can be found within Margaret McDougall's notes. So for instance, Oldcastle Road, name derived from the Old Castle of Inverness, reputed to have been situated here, also reputed to have been the site of King Duncan's murder by Macbeth. Exchange Place, which is no longer called Exchange Place, the Old Marketplace or Exchange of the Borough. By order of the Town Council, all goods had to be exposed for sale at the Market Cross. Or Factory Street, from the old thread factory which was established in 1765 and by the year 1790 employed 1,000 people. So those kind of names, those church streets, castle streets, tower roads, bank street, those kind of things, they're very common and they tell a story of what a place is or was like, what was on that site. Another very common type of street name are those that refer to something, a more permanent type of landmark. They're pointing to something in the landscape. So for instance, Lochinver's Canisp Road, directing you towards the mountain, or Peffrey Road in Dingwall, referring to the river. So they may point to landmarks that are man-made that come and go, or they may point to landmarks that have a much longer place in the landscape. And often a town will have many of these. So for instance, if you go to Dornoch, don't go yet, but if you go to Dornoch, you can stand at the meeting point of Bridge Street, Church Street and Castle Street and be just a few steps from School Hill, High Street, Shore Street and Station Road, which is a really good illustration of that point. And if we stay in Dornoch just for a moment, if you were to walk along Castle Street or walk along the High Street, you could turn off onto St Gilbert Street. And that takes me to the next group of street names, those that are named after people. If you watched the Learn with Lorna about the history of Dornoch, back in the days when Facebook made it easy for me to go live with Learn with Lorna, didn't throw problems in my way. If you watched the Learn with Lorna about the history of Dornoch, you might remember the importance of St Gilbert to that story. He was the founder and the funder of Dornoch Cathedral, and therefore he's remembered in the street that lies next to it. And something similar can be seen in Tain, where Duthoc Wynd commemorates St Duthoc, the patron saint of Tain, whose connection to the borough is remembered not only in the street name, but also in buildings like schools and churches, the community centre, and so on. And those two places are particularly linked with specific saints, but you can also find examples of other saints in street names across the Highlands. So for instance, St Columba's Road in Newton Moor, which links to St Columba and also to St Columba's Church, or St Andrew's Drive in Inverness. Monarchs are the next group that feature very heavily in street names. There are multiple examples of King Street, Queen Street, George Street, Victoria Road, Albert Street, and so on. And sometimes the exact namesake of these is very clear. You can remember in that example about Petty Street, they talk about renaming it as Victoria Street or Albert Street, and that's right towards the end of Victoria's reign. So sometimes it's quite clear who the inspiration is. But sometimes if it's King Street or Queen Street, you might need to dig a little bit deeper to find out when the road was built or when it was renamed. Here are two examples from Irene Main Mackintosh's book, Street Names of Nairn, which we hold a copy of at the Highland Archive Centre. Leopold Street, leading from the High Street to the A96. Leopold Street was originally called Pole Road and got its name from a pole which stood at the corner of the street and pointed to Inverness. In 1819, Prince Leopold, the Duke of Albany, fourth son of Queen Victoria, paid a visit to the town on his way to Fort George, most probably to inspect the troops of the 72nd Regiment. He received the freedom of the royal borough, and because of this, Pole Road became Leopold Street. So sometimes there is a very clear moment where that happens and a reason for it, and a documented reason that this street was renamed after this specific person because of a specific occasion. But sometimes you need a little bit more detective work, as this example shows. Queen Street is situated in Nairn on the right after St Ninian Church. there is some doubt that this street was called after Queen Victoria, because in Wood's map of 1821, Queen Street is shown as existing at that time prior to Victoria's reign. We assume it may have been called after Queen Charlotte, who died in 1818, as Queen Adelaide, wife of William IV, was not crowned until 1831. So sometimes you need to do a little bit of digging to work out exactly who it refers to. Whereas Queen Street in Inverness was renamed after Queen Victoria, having previously been called Central School Lane, because that was the location of Central School. And so when, as the school moved, the street becomes renamed after Victoria. Landowners and people of local prominence abound in street names. There are numerous examples of Duke Streets, or streets which either carry the first names or the surnames of a landlord, or perhaps references to the estates, the titles, or the family members of landlords. And I hesitated there because I was thinking, well, Duke Street, there's so many of them, but it depends where you are in the Highlands. It might be the Duke of Sutherland, it might be the Duke of Gordon, it might be the Duke of Argyll. It depends where you are. So, for instance, Brora has Stafford Terrace and Gower Street, which surely are linked to the Levison Gowers, the Dukes of Sutherland and the Marquesses of Stafford. Galsby has Sybil Road and Millicent Avenue, both are first names of women within the same family. Fort William has Monsey Square, after the Cameron Campbells of Monsey, who purchased the fort in the 1800s. It has Cameron Road, Fassifern Road, Lochiel Road, all connected to the Cameron Estates and the Cameron Highlanders. The area around Dingwall is Munro country, and the Munros of Fowles and Navarre feature within the street names in Dingwall. It's also the country of the Mackenzies of Seaforth, and so in Dingwall we find Munro Place, Seaforth Gardens. In Alness we find Munro Terrace coming off Navarre Road. So partly that's pointing to the places, pointing to Navarre, but it's pointing as well to the families and the landowners. In Wick, Barragill Street recalls James Sinclair, Earl of Caithness, whose estates included Barragill Castle. And again, some of those references are explicit and very clear, and some are not. If you have a listen to this couple of examples from within Margaret McDougall's notes, you'll see how some can be very, very clearly linked, and others you need to have a bit of background knowledge now to make the connection. So, for instance, Kenneth Street, named after Sir Kenneth Matheson of Ardross. Ardross Place, Ardross Street and Ardross Terrace, named after the late Sir Kenneth Matheson's estate of that name. Sir Kenneth was the land superior and helped to open up the district as a residential quarter of the town. So we can see that Kenneth is after his first name, Ardross is after his main estates. But then Percival Road in Inverness, named after Sir Kenneth Matheson's wife, whose maiden name was Percival. Attadale Road, a place name after Attadale in the west coast. Sir Kenneth Matheson had connections to Attadale, and this name may have been an indirect compliment to him. Duncraig Street, after Kenneth Matheson's estate of that same name. So as I say, sometimes it's a very quick and clear, easy connection, and sometimes to understand why that name was chosen, you maybe need to do more research into what was happening at the time and the connections of the people who had influence. But it's not just landowners. Provosts and local dignitaries also appear in street names, as this extract from Irene Maid Mackintosh's booklet about Nairn shows. Cumming Street. Cumming Street was named after Sir Alexander Penrose Cumming of Altyre, who served as provost in our town for two periods between 1797 and 1806, and was the Nairn delegate in Parliament. He was described as a notable man of his day, with strong character and striking appearance. He dressed flamboyantly, with velvet coat, lace worn at the throat and wrists, with gold garters and belts, and often sported an enamel powder horn and inlaid pistols, once owned by James VI of Scotland. So he sounds like a bit of a character. But there are also references to people of significance or prominence within specific fields, so maybe not the provost or someone in the town council, but maybe someone who's important in another way. So we have several Telford streets in the Highlands, in Wick and in Inverness and elsewhere, named for Thomas Telford, the engineer. We have Mitchell's Lane, named for Joseph Mitchell, the engineer. Neil Gunn Road in Dingwall commemorates the writer Neil Gunn. And sometimes the people referred to were particularly important in the development of that area. So some of them might just be important characters or people who have made a difference generally, like Telford. But sometimes it might be someone who is very specifically linked to that area. And some great examples of this can be found in Caithness. So if you have a listen to these notes that my colleagues in Nucleus put together for me, it's quite astonishing. Thomas Telford constructed a new harbour on the south side of Wick River, began in 1803 and completed in 1810, so hence why we have Telford Street in Wick. Potley Town was developed around this harbour due to the expansion of the herring industry and was designed and laid out by Telford in 1807 as one of the first planned towns of the 19th century. So there's a difference immediately. We're not going back in Potley Town hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years where the origins of names have been kind of lost. The land was obtained by from Sir Benjamin Dunbar of Hempriggs and amounted to 390 acres. By 1816, Potley Town, which was named after one of the governors of the society, this is the British Fisheries Society, Sir William Potley, was well established. Initially, Potley Town and Wick were separate boroughs, but the British Fisheries Society gave Potley Town a measure of self-government in 1848, and then in 1902 the boroughs of Wick and Potley Town were amalgamated into the Royal Borough of Wick. Some of the streets in Wick and Potley Town are named after female relatives of directors of the British Fisheries Society, such as Martha Terrace and Barbara Place, but the majority of names given to the older streets in Potley Town are named after the directors, shareholders and agents of the British Fisheries Society and their estates. And what was astonishing about this when the team at Nucleus sent this to me was it was an enormous list of streets all named after people who were shareholders or directors of British fisheries. So just a few examples. Beaufoy Street, after Henry Beaufoy MP, Director of British Fisheries Society. Brown Place, after Isaac Hawkins Brown MP, Director of British Fisheries Society. Kinnaird Street, George William Fox Kinnaird, 9th Baron Kinnaird, British Fisheries Society shareholder. Loch Street, after James Loch, the Deputy Governor of British Fisheries and MP for Wick Boroughs. Rutherford Street, after Andrew Rutherford, Scottish Judge, Solicitor General for Scotland, shareholder in British Fisheries Society. So it was remarkable. As I say, I've just shared a couple of examples, but that list goes on and on and on of how many of the streets in Potley Town were named after British Fisheries Society directors and shareholders. Sometimes people, and I'm guessing in that instance, sometimes people have a bit of influence of being able to call a street a name. Sometimes we look back into the distant past and find names, but sometimes people have a bit of say about being named in a street name. So for instance, local builders quite often named streets after themselves or after their family members. And there are street names that are linked to the occupations that were prominent on a street to recognise the industry that might be in that place or groups of people associated with it. So for instance, Dempster Gardens in Inverness, which no longer exists, was named after a hangman who lived there, Dempster being the Doomster. Smith's Lane in Nairn, which it could be named after Charles Smith, who was the borough treasurer, but to me it seems more likely that it was named after Daniel Clark, who was a blacksmith who had his smith business on Smith's Lane for 50 years, and the smithy is very clearly marked on the map. I really enjoyed Society Street in Nairn. It's one of those ones that you go past and think, why is it called Society Street? But I can tell you that because, again, we hold records relating to it. Society Street was first called after the Nairn Fishermen's Society, reputed to be one of the first cooperative societies recorded in Scotland. This was at the beginning of a distinctly Scottish concept introduced in the 18th century. In the Borough Cartulary of the 1st of January 1773, a few right and disposition was made by the magistrates and the Borough Council of Nairn in favour of the Nairn Society of Fishermen. The area of ground involved, incorporated what is now Society Street. So it's marking the importance of the Fishermen's Society to that community. The decision about what we call our streets, how we name our streets, says a huge amount about who we are, particularly when we make a decision to name a street after a person. It talks to who we are as a society, what we value, who we look up to, who we want to honour and commemorate. And because what we value and what we honour and who we want to pay respect to changes over time, street names can become surprisingly controversial. So for instance, Dundas Street in Edinburgh was the scene of controversy in 2020 when attempts were made to change its name to Emancipation Street in recognition of the charge that Henry Dundas, the 18th century politician who it was named after, had deliberately delayed the abolition of slavery. But like everything, it's actually more complicated than that. And even people with problematic legacies often have elements that are positive. But it's a really good example of how incendiary street names can be because of what they say about us as a society and what we choose to commemorate. So I was intrigued then, knowing that, when I came across in Alness, Hugh Mackenzie Avenue, David Ogg Grove and David Ross Street, sitting alongside Sandy McRae Street and Dr. Stuart Campbell Court, because they seem so much more recent names. You know, they seem much more modern sounding names. So I did a bit of investigating, and I found the minute of the Highland Council Skye, Ross and Cromarty Area Committee, who made that decision in 2015. And it notes that those names were chosen to recognise old Alnesians and their significant community contribution, the contribution that they had made to Alness over their lifetimes. And again, it throws up the question of who do we choose to honour and memorialise. There's something really empowering about naming ordinary people within street names. The naming of streets after individuals is historically very common after a conflict. If you think how many Wellington streets there are, or Nelson streets. Cavell Gardens in Inverness is a good example of this. Cavell Gardens was named for the British nurse Edith Cavell, who, after treating indiscriminately troops from both sides of the conflict in World War I, was then sentenced to death by firing squad after helping over 200 Allied troops escape. This was an event which caused widespread outrage, and people were devastated and angry and very emotionally charged about the execution of Edith Cavell. And among the things they do to tackle it is they name Cavell Gardens in Inverness after her, and there are many other places with her name. And events such as World War I and others also feature prominently in our street names, sometimes telling us about something very local. So for instance, Union Street in Inverness is named after, to pay tribute to the group of people, public-spirited men, it says, who united to build that street. So they might commemorate a very local event, but often it's events of national and international significance that appear in our street names. I mentioned Nelson Street. Well, there are many Waterloo places, Waterloo streets, Trafalgar Square, Trafalgar Roads, things like that. In Inverness, Waterloo Place was previously called Veterans Row, again as a link to the military and the people who had served in the Napoleonic conflicts. In Nairn, Lodge Hill Road used to be called Maida Street. Maida Place in Nairn, as in London, was probably called after the Battle of Maida. This was a British victory against the First French Empire in Calabria and Naples, Italy, in July 1806. Major General John Stewart was in command of the British troops, which included the men of the 78th Highland Regiment Ross Buffs. This regiment, along with the 72nd Highland Regiment, was amalgamated in 1881 and became the Seaforth Highlanders, our local regiment, which had its headquarters in Fort George. So you can see there that connection to a military victory, a British military victory, but also a connection to the nearby barracks at Fort George. And that connection to a nearby barracks is really interesting. In Inverness, the streets surrounding the Cameron Barracks include Alamein Drive, Anzio Road, Somme Crescent, Marne Road, Burma Court, Tobruk Road. And all of those are in recognition of World War I and World War II battles, so significant to the story of the Cameron Highlanders and to the military in general. So their proximity next to the barracks is important. So sometimes the locations of where we name our street are very significant. In Invergordon, that famous port town, Royal Oak Drive and Natal Place sit side by side, both recalling the mass loss of life at sea when the HMS Royal Oak and HMS Natal sank, one in World War I and one in World War II. And again, it's something that is so relevant to that particular community with their connection to the Navy, particularly the Natal, which sank so nearby. But it's not just conflict. There are other events and activities that appear in our street names. Fort William has Camanachd Crescent, pointing to the Shinty. Brora has Salt Street because of the salt-making past of the town. Inverness has Jamaica Street, India Street, Madras Street, all hinting at trade and empire and slavery and journeys in and out of the port. But I wanted to finish just by looking at a few of the more unusual street names that we have. In Alness we have the Corkscrew. I am guessing that is so called because it is a winding road. If anyone is in Alness and has better information about this, please let me know. But I just came across it as I was looking for something else, and I was like, the Corkscrew is a great name. It's like the Wisp in Edinburgh. In Nairn, we still have the Maggot, which we had in Inverness too. There are several suggestions about the derivation for the name the Maggot. It could be from the Gaelic the mag, for a plain or a flat area. So for instance, like the Macher, maybe it's the same derivation, I'm not sure. And both are indeed flat areas next to water, kind of marshy bits of land. It's also said it could be a corruption of Margaret, Scotland's royal saint, so it could be that Maggot has come out of Margaret. One of my favourites that I have mentioned many times before, I am sure, one that is no longer with us, is Doomsdale, Castle Street in Inverness, previously known as Doomsdale because it was the route from the prison to the gallows. So, if you want to learn any more about street names, where should you look? Well, definitely spend some time wandering about wherever you are looking at street names. Some might be apparent, some might need a bit more digging. Have a look at maps. We have thousands, tens of thousands of maps within the Archive Service, and there's always somebody in every group tour that I do who loves looking at maps. Valuation rolls are really useful for this, particularly if you're interested in Inverness. The 1922 to 23 Inverness Borough Valuation Roll, for some reason unknown to me, because no other valuation roll does it, it records the street names and what it was previously called. So for instance, it says Baron Taylor Street, previously the Black Vennel. And when I looked in Margaret McDougall's notes, she says the old name of this street was the Black Vennel. In a deed dated from 1620, it is called the Common Vennel, leading from the Kirk Street to the east. In another deed, it is called the Back Vennel. It was renamed after Mr. John Taylor, merchant, who purchased considerable property in the Vennel and purchased a superiority which entitled him to be enrolled amongst the barons. He was thenceforth referred to as Baron Taylor, and the street gradually lost its old name to become Baron Taylor Street. So, maps, valuation rolls, Margaret McDougall's wonderful notes, other people's research notes. If you've got a local history society or someone who has done a lot of research into that area, they may well have looked into street names. And then Town Council and County Council minutes, because those are the ones making the decisions official. It's the Town Council and the County Council who have that decision on whether to go ahead with a change of street name. And also, when new developments come about, they are the ones who discuss, should a new development all include all names of trees, as we have somewhere in Inverness, or all names of Scottish islands, or all names of borders towns, or whatever it might be. particularly if you're looking at when big estates come into being. So for instance, again in Inverness, Dalney, Drummond, Hilton, when those ones were being formed, you can look at the town council minutes to see the discussions around what those street names should be. What do we want to commemorate and mark? What story do we want to tell? In 1965, as an example, there seems to be a theme appearing in development of Lachen and Kinmiley's area, where we have Pict Avenue, Iona Road and King Brood Road coming out. So you can sometimes see a theme that's being discussed. You can often see the whole process as well, and the names that might have been proposed or rejected. I even found a proposal in the Town Council minutes to name a new street in Drummond, Ward Avenue, after the ex-Treasurer Ward. But it notes that that didn't go ahead because he phoned them to say that while he appreciated the gesture, he felt surely there had to be a more suitable and appropriate name than naming it after him. So we can find people who turn down having a street named after them. So street names can tell us about languages, about communications, about landscapes and people and events and buildings, and they can shine a light on our priorities, on our values, and teach us something about our past, or about how we want to present our past. Endlessly fascinating, and I've only scratched the surface of it. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Apologies again that getting it to go live was traumatic for all involved, and why I feel like I've been very stumbly because I was thrown by having to restart 5 times or whatever I said. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. I hope you can join me next week. We'll be looking at some records relating to kelp in our collections. But in the meantime, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're really grateful.